Good afternoon. Welcome to the Akron Roundtable. I am Michael Swartz, President of the Akron Roundtable Board of Directors. The Roundtable is brought to you over radio station WKSU 89.7 FM from the Quaker Station at the Quaker Inn on the campus of the University of Akron. The radio broadcast is underwritten by Cascade Outing. Today's program is generously sponsored by the University of Akron. Additionally, we would like to recognize the Akron Beacon Journal, the Kiwanis Club of Akron, and the Greater Akron Chamber for being legacy sponsors. Please mark your calendar now for our next regularly scheduled luncheon on Thursday, June 18th, when the Roundtable will host David Green, host of NPR's Morning Edition. To make a reservation for any of the Akron Roundtable luncheons or to purchase a subscription to our luncheon series, please visit our website at akronroundtable.org. Today, we are very pleased to host Michael Morell, former acting director and deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He will share his insights with us on the topic of today's national security threats. In recognition of our distinguished speaker, as well as a sold-out audience, we have adapted the format of our luncheon to allow your questions to guide more of today's presentation. At your tables, you will find note cards available for your written questions. Later in the program, our moderator and program chair, David Hunter, will signal you to raise those cards, and we will collect those questions to be presented to our speaker. At this time, I now ask Fran Buckholzer, a member of the Roundtable Board, to introduce our speaker.
This is just going to be a smashing program. As the recently retired Deputy Director of the CIA with 30 years of service in the agency, our speaker today is one of the country's most prominent national security professionals with extensive experience in foreign policy. He served 6 presidents, traveled the world, and personally met with many important world leaders, particularly in the Middle East. As top CIA officer, he's played a critical role in most of the important counterterrorism events of the last 2 decades. So it goes without saying that the topic today's national security threats, could not be more timely in terms of setting the stage and giving us the proper perspective and background we need to more ably interpret and understand very troubling current events, especially those in the Middle East. From ISIS' recent violent takeover of Ramadi in Iraq, only 70 miles from Baghdad, to ISIS' recent capture of Palmyra, deep inside Syria, putting nearly half of the country now under the control of jihadists. To the frightening activities of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and their very dangerous leader and ingenious bomb maker, Ibrahim al-Asiri. To what are the implications of China's island building in the South China Sea and Putin's ambition to recreate the Russian Empire? All raising questions as to what is the potential impact of these events on America's national security in the future, to how concerned or involved should Americans be in these very worrisome situations. Challenging questions, to say the least. Now, of particular interest to those of us here today is that this internationally recognized expert on national security and counterterrorism is also a hometown boy who grew up in Cuyahoga Falls, went to Cuyahoga Falls High School, graduated summa cum laude in economics from the wonderful University of Akron, and earned his MA in economics from Georgetown University. Happily, he maintains close ties to his sister Karen Dale and her family in Cuyahoga Falls, as well as others in Northeast Ohio. He currently is a member of the board of directors of Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, works closely with Dr. John Marine at the Wyss Institute, and serves on an advisory board for the president of the University of Akron. In addition to being a member, of a nationally recognized consulting firm in Washington, D.C. He is a commentator and expert on national security and terrorism for CBS, a senior fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and a senior fellow at West Point Center on Combating Terror, as well, of course, as being connected with other such organizations and boards interested in his expertise. Now, with the encouragement of colleagues, our speaker today has written a book entitled The Great War of Our Time, The CIA's Fight Against Terrorism from Al-Qaeda to ISIS. And of course will be available for those of you that are interested, and I'm sure most of you will be, in the lobby after the program. And I just learned that this book is on the New York Times bestseller list. So we have a hot item here now. Pretty exciting stuff. As they say in politics, he takes names and gives dates. I must agree with Grant Allison, former dean of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, when he says, and I quote, "It's a must-read for anyone thinking seriously about terrorism. The book is an authoritative, insightful insider's account of the CIA's leadership in the war on terror, whose author courageously ducks none of the thorny issues from torture and Snowden to Osama bin Laden." Now, in the past, our speaker gave national briefings to presidents of the United States. At the end of his book, he also gives his readers an extremely informative briefing and specific updates on current and pending terrorism challenging the United States, especially in the Middle East. I would also like to add that our speaker's integrity, loyalty to his peers, commitment to protecting our country, and love of family is truly inspirational. So with no more ado, I would like to formally introduce this outstanding leader, dedicated patriot of whom we're all very proud, Summit County's very own Mike Morell, former deputy director of the CIA, an important voice for America's national security, who will be responding to questions posed by our luncheon moderator, David Petraeus. Thank you.
If I could just say one thing before we start, let me just thank all of you for coming. This is an amazing turnout. I've been on the road for almost a month now doing TV, radio, and events like this for the book, and this is the largest crowd that I've had, so thank you all for coming. It's great that it's an afternoon. And a real special thank you to Fran for really setting this up. This wouldn't have happened without her. And to Dr. Mazaloff, it is not true that he required people to buy a ticket to this event in order to get an appointment. That is not true. But thank you, Earl.
Very good. Thank you, Michael, for being here. Let's start off with this question. This has been a very busy week in Washington with regard to federal legislation dealing with matters of national security. We had an unexpected expiration of the Patriot Act, sort of a hurried passage of the Freedom Act. There's a broad array of views throughout the country on how people look at this federal legislation. How do you view it? Do you view it as an essential tool for combating foreign threats of terrorism, as some do, or as others do, as potential overreach, threatening our civil liberties, or something else?
How about both? Okay, how about both? So I was on President Obama's commission on the question of how do we balance security with privacy and civil liberties, and so we really wrestled with this question. The legislation that was passed yesterday is really about the Section 215 of the Patriot Act's telephone metadata program, and that's where the National Security Agency collected from phone companies. Sometimes you get the idea that they were out there collecting it in the ether. They weren't. Collected from the phone companies the metadata of most phone calls made in the United States. What's metadata? It's the phone number doing the calling, it's the phone number that was called, and it's the duration of the call. That's it. Nothing else. No names of whose phone number it is, no location, no content, right? The National Security Agency had none of that. This program, from a national security perspective, very important. It fills a gap that existed prior to 9/11. I can't tell you with certainty, but I believe that if this program had been in place prior to 9/11, that it's possible that we would have seen the communications between the 9/11 hijackers and we could have prevented the attack. It fills that seam between international and domestic. Very, very important. So it's very important that it continues in some way. At the same time, there were legitimate concerns about privacy and civil liberties. Absolutely. Right? If I've got the phone number that did the calling and the phone number that was called, I can do a very quick internet search and learn that Michael Morell did the calling. And I called my psychiatrist. Or I called my mistress. Right? You can find out a lot. I don't have a psychiatrist and I don't have
That was going to be my next question.
It's all hypothetical here. Okay? But you see where I'm going. There's, as long as the government has this data in its hands, there's a potential for abuse. There was no abuse at all that we could find on the commission in terms of the way this program is implemented, but there was the potential for abuse. So what our commission recommended to President Obama was keep the program, to take the data out of the hands of the government and put it keep it in the hands of the telephone companies, and when the government wants to query the data, the government can go to the phone companies or the court worker. That's exactly what the House passed in the Freedom Act. That's exactly what the Senate passed yesterday. Both of them overwhelmingly, and it's what the president was advocating all along. So I think we ended up in a better place where the government still has the tools it needs to fill that gap, that pre-9/11 gap, while better protecting privacy and civil liberties.
Fran Buckholzer mentioned this in her introduction, and you write about it in your book, about your role, among other things, briefing the president. And I know that we spoke very much about how you briefed President Bush for 1 year, 2001. Can you give us some insight on your briefing that year with particular focus on September?
Yeah, so I briefed the president from January 4th, 2001, when he was still the president-elect, until January 4th, 2002, when I turned it over to my successor. I briefed him 6 days a week, wherever he was. And this was new for the CIA. We had never traveled with the president before. So I briefed him in the Oval Office, I briefed him at Camp David, I briefed him at his ranch in Texas, I briefed him when he was traveling domestically, I briefed him when he was traveling overseas. 6 days a week, sometimes 7. And because of that, not surprisingly, I was with him on September 11th. People often ask me to kind of describe the day, and what I tell them is it was a mixture of the intensity of doing your job with the surreal. And an example of the intensity of doing your job, on the flight from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where we landed and took on food and water and kicked a bunch of people off the plane, to Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, where the president did a secure video teleconference with his national security team. The president asked to see me. And so it was the president, his chief of staff, Andy Card, and me. And the president looked at me and said, "Michael, who did this?" And I told him, "Mr. President, I haven't seen any intelligence that would take us to responsibility one way or the other, but so what I'm going to tell you is my own kind of personal view here." And he said, "I understand, I get on with it." I told him, "Mr. President, there's 2 countries in the world that have the capability to do this, Iran and Iraq, but both of them have absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose from doing this." I said, "No, Mr. President, I am certain that the trail is going to lead to Osama bin Laden and to Al Qaeda." I told him that I would bet my children's future on it, and I've never told them that. And then he looked at me and he said, "When will we know? When will we know?" That's a great example of a kind of question you get asked as a presidential briefer, and there's not an answer to, right? So what you can do, the only thing you can do is provide context. That's what I did. What I did is I walked through the previous terrorist attacks against the United States and how long it took us to find out, in each case, who did it with a significant level of certainty. And there was a big range, from a couple days to several months. And so I walked him through that, and I said, so Mr. President, we may find out soon, and yet again, this may take some time. So that's an example of the intensity of doing your job. An example of the surreal is when you land at Andrews Air Force Base from the west to the east, the Pentagon is out the left side of the aircraft. And that night, when I looked out the left side of the aircraft, there was an F-16 on one wing. It's from the DC Air National Guard. And there was an F-16 on the other wing. It was so close that you could see the facial features of the pilot. And in the distance, you could see the still burning Pentagon, flames and smoke. So that's an example of the surreal.
Thank you for that gripping answer here. I know that you've also had opportunity to serve as a presidential briefer for President Obama. If you were briefing him now, what are the threats that you outlined to him as the most dangerous to our country?
So I divide national security into two categories: national security threats and national security challenges. That if you don't manage them properly, they become threats. In the threat category at the top of the list, I would still put international terrorism. I'd still put Al Qaeda on the top of that list and ISIS second. Talk about that more if you want. But let me sum it up this way by saying if Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, this is the Al Qaeda group that's in Yemen, this is the Al Qaeda group that has significant freedom of movement as a result of the civil war there. It's happening today. If they brought down an airliner tomorrow in the United States of America, I would not be surprised. They have that desire, they have those capabilities, they have the operatives who want to do it. The last 3 attempted attacks against the United States by an outside terrorist group were by Al Qaeda in Yemen. The Christmas Day bomber in 2009. The printer cartridge plot, which was an explosive hidden inside a well-wrapped printer cartridge that an airport X-ray machine couldn't see and that a bomb-sniffing dog could not get on. An attempt to bring down 2 cargo planes with that bomb in 2010. And the non-metallic suicide vest, the suicide vest filled with explosives with no metal parts. An attempt to bring down an airliner in 2011. So the last 3 attempted attacks were by Al Qaeda in Yemen. So they're at the top of the list. So terrorism, number 1. Number 2, and rising really fast, fastest growing threat facing us is cyber. You know, cyber is not a threat itself. It's a medium through which our adversaries attack us. The adversaries are many, a whole bunch of state actors. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, all trying to do different things by attacking us, stealing data, trying to bring down systems. So you go from states to criminal groups. Very interestingly, the amount of money made by cyber criminals is now greater than the illicit drug trade. The amount of money made by cyber criminals is now greater than the illicit drug trade. And then the third adversary in cyber are insiders. People that work inside your own organization, either because they're just sloppy or more dangerously because for some reason they just get mad at you and want to take it out on you, and they've got the right accesses and they do tremendous damage. The best example of that is Edward Snowden. So terrorism, cyber, and then number three on the list of threats is Iran. I believe Iran is a lethal and strategic threat to the United States of America and will be for the next 25 to 30 years. It's something we have to get our arms around. On the challenge side, China is number 1. China is not a threat. China is a challenge. If we don't manage it properly, it will become a threat. It is in nobody's interest that it become a threat. There's a couple things that are pulling us together, and there's a couple things that are pulling us apart. And we really need leadership in both Washington and Beijing in order to have this come out right. Second on that list, I would put, on the challenge side, is I would put Russia. Fran got it exactly right. Vladimir Putin has a long-term plan to reestablish the Russian Empire, which, by the way, just happens to match up to the former Soviet Union. He believes he has He's got a number of years in order to do this. He believes he's not going anywhere. He plans to be the leader of Russia for a long time to come. He's a very scary guy. He is a bully. He is a thug. He only understands relative power. He's a risk taker. And when he takes a risk and succeeds, he often is willing to take a bigger risk, which makes him very, very dangerous. And he believes something that he does not believe in, something that every businessman in this room believes. Right? If you're a businessman in this room, you understand that you can sit down and have a negotiation with somebody and end up with win-win. He believes only in win-lose in a negotiation. So that also makes him very dangerous and very, very difficult to deal with. So Russia's number 2. And then number 3, I would say what's happening in general in the Middle East. The most significant change in the Middle East in 100 years. And if you find anybody who can tell, who tells you that they know what the Middle East is going to look like in 5 years, they're either lying to you or they have no idea what they're talking about. I can't tell you what it's going to look like in 6 months or a year. That's how much change is going on and how rapidly that change is occurring in probably the most important place on the planet from a national security perspective.
In your earlier responses, you've referenced ISIS, so let's take a minute to go there. The big news for the last year has been the spread of ISIS throughout the Middle East. Do you think our policies to curtail ISIS are working?
So let me just back up a little bit and say, okay, where did this group come from? One of the things you've heard is, there's been a lot of finger pointing at different presidents as to who started this problem, which is a horrible waste of time, right? From my perspective, in actually solving the problem. But it's important to understand where they came from, so you can think about how you solve it. So ISIS started as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq started after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And it particularly started after the United States made 2 policy decisions. One policy decision was to say that if you were a member of Saddam's Ba'ath Party, you could not serve in any government position, including the Iraqi military. And the second was to disband any organization that had significantly close ties to the Ba'ath Party. Well, that was a lot of people, right? If you were a young Iraqi and you wanted to get ahead, you joined the Ba'ath Party. It's like if you're a young Chinese guy and you want to get ahead, you join the Communist Party, right? That's how you get ahead. So there was a bunch of people in the Ba'ath Party who, didn't believe in Saddam Hussein. They just wanted to get ahead. So these 2 decisions ended up destroying the Iraqi military, destroying the Iraqi security service, and destroying the Iraqi intelligence service. They ceased to exist. And so that created a security vacuum overnight. And all of those guys who used to get paychecks, all of a sudden weren't getting paychecks anymore. So what did they do? They went and joined the insurgency against the U.S. occupation and the new Iraqi government, and they joined Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And so overnight, they were strengthened. So Al-Qaeda in Iraq became this huge problem in 2004, 2005, 2006, and killed many Americans, killed many American soldiers on the battlefield. But by the time that we left Iraq at the end of 2011, they were at their weakest point. When we left, 2 things happened. When we left, the military pressure was reduced significantly. Why? Because the U.S. was such an important component in putting that military pressure on them. And so from a military perspective, they started to rebound. And then the other thing that happened when we left was former Prime Minister Maliki was emboldened to take a series of political steps that alienated and disenfranchised Sunnis in Iraq. And so you had moderate Sunnis who had no interest in Al-Qaeda's ideology, all of a sudden either supporting AQI or actually joining them. And so another part of their rebound. And so they were strengthening considerably after 2011. CIA was reporting all of that to the president, to the national security team, to Congress. And then the Syrian civil war starts. And when you're a terrorist group, you want to get on the action. So AQI wanted to go to Syria, and did go to Syria. but you can't call yourself Al-Qaeda in Iraq when you're in Syria. So they changed the name to ISIS. It was a rebranding. And ISIS, when it was in Syria, grew incredibly strong. 3 reasons. One is they got their hands on a whole bunch of recruits, both Syrians and foreigners who had come to Syria to fight against President Assad. 2 is they got their hands on weapons, and they got their hands on money. And they went back to Iraq and they did this blitzkrieg. And we reported all of that. I think what surprised us was how quickly the Iraqi security services fell apart, which you can also blame on President Maliki for putting a bunch of incompetent generals in charge and really destroying the Iraqi military over a period of years. My view about how we're doing on this very quickly, I think the strategy in Iraq, despite the loss of Ramadi, which I think was significant, I think our strategy in Iraq will eventually pay off. I think we will take back the territory that ISIS took in Iraq. We've already taken back about 25%. That's something that's not well known out there. That's the context, right? Lost Ramadi, but we won 25% back of what they've taken. As confident as I am of the strategy in Syria, right, which is use air power and Iraqi troops on the ground, I have no confidence in Syria that we can take back what they've taken in Syria because there's no ground troops there. Right? There's only air power, and you can't win just with air power. So I think what's going to happen is you are going to slowly see the Iraqis push ISIS into Syria. So you have a hammer, but you've got no anvil in Syria. And so they're just going to end up in eastern Syria with a safe haven there. If they have a safe haven long enough, they're going to start focusing on attacks here in the United States.
You know, that segment of your book that addresses ISIS seems to be getting a great deal of attention. But you note in your book that there are other more dangerous groups out there that should be worried about. Can you address that briefly?
So I've already talked about one. Right, so I would say that Al-Qaeda is still more dangerous to the homeland than is ISIS. What threats do ISIS pose right now? The most significant threat that ISIS poses is to the stability of the Middle East. So the loss of the territorial integrity of Iraq, the loss of the territorial integrity of Syria could easily spread to the rest of the region, to Jordan, to Saudi Arabia, some other of the Gulf states. That would be a disaster. So the same kind of sectarian violence that you see in Syria, that you see in Iraq, spreading right to the rest of the region. That's the biggest threat they pose today. That's why we're there. That's why we're back there in a military sense. 2 terrorist threats that they pose to the homeland today. One is their ability to radicalize young men and young women here in the United States who have never been to Iraq and Syria. Right? Just through their narrative and through their polished social media, almost Madison Avenue, quality social media, they are radicalizing young men and young women here. And so you are going to see attacks. You're going to see attacks like happened in Texas a month ago. Absolutely you are. You're going to see more of those. And then the other threat they pose is there's been about 200 to 300 Americans who have actually gone to fight in Iraq and Syria for ISIS. So it's possible that ISIS could direct one of those individuals to come back to the United States to conduct an attack. But you're probably not talking about a very sophisticated attack in either one of those 2 attack scenarios here. But Al-Qaeda is a bigger threat, right? They can do bigger attacks. I talked about Al-Qaeda in Yemen already. There's also a group in Syria called the Khorasan group, which is associated with the Al-Qaeda group in Syria. You actually have 2 Islamic extremist groups in Syria, ISIS and al-Nusra. And this Khorasan group is part of al-Nusra, and it's al-Nusra's external operations arm. And it's a bunch of guys who used to be in Pakistan who came to Syria to help al-Nusra organize itself to fight President Assad, but they started focusing on attacks overseas. One of the things that they've done is found a way to put sophisticated explosives into a laptop, which is why you have to take your laptop out now when you're going through a TSA line. Right? So they're very dangerous. And then finally, the original Al-Qaeda group in South Asia, the original Al-Qaeda group in those tribal areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan that are very difficult to get at. Same people that brought you that tragedy on 9/11. They've been significantly degraded, but they still pose a threat.
Before we turn to the next question, I'd like to just remind the audience and prompt them now that if you do have questions, please raise them. They'll be gathered, and we'll try and ask as many as we can. Turning to the next question, in your book, you actually discuss how Edward Snowden's security leaks were a contributing factor to the spread of ISIS. How is this so?
So, I gotta be careful with the details here. I don't want to give anything away, unlike Edward Snowden. So, the first Snowden disclosures were made public in early June of 2013. I left my job in August of 2013. In that 2 months, I saw terrorist organizations change the way that they communicate as a result of what they learned from those disclosures, making it more difficult for us to track them. And it's my understanding that that learning on the part of those terrorist organizations has continued. And that one of the groups that learned some of the most from what was disclosed was ISIS. And a very good friend of mine, who happened to run the National Counterterrorism Center, gave a public testimony just about 6 months ago to Congress in which he said that he has no doubt that the Snowden disclosures aided ISIS's rise. Didn't cause it, right, but aided it.
I have a two-part question here. Can you talk further about the damage that Snowden's leaks foisted on our country, and why do you think he did what he did?
Let's take the second one first, right? I tried very hard in the book not to make assessments of people's motivations when they say something or when they do something or when they make a decision. I learned long ago as an intelligence analyst that when you start speculating about people's motivations, you're almost always wrong. Almost always wrong. But the one place that I couldn't help myself do this was with regard to Snowden. And he says that he did this because he wanted to protect the privacy and civil liberties of Americans. I don't really believe that. After all, the guy stole almost 1 million documents, the vast majority of which, probably over 99%, had nothing to do with the privacy and civil liberties of Americans. Now, I think what motivated Edward Snowden, and you see this same psychological profile in people who end up spying for other countries, is this is all about Edward Snowden. This is not about privacy and civil liberties. This is all about Edward Snowden. He believes that he is one of the smartest people on the planet. He believes that when he worked for CIA and when he worked for NSA, that they did not recognize his brilliance. And he wanted to show the world his brilliance. And that's why he did this. He could have given those documents to the media about some of those programs that he thought were unlawful, and never become a public figure. He chose to be a public figure. He chooses to go on TV, right? And every time the media runs to him and asks him a question, they're feeding exactly what he wants. It's hard to say the damage, back to the first part of the question, it's really hard to say the damage that he did. 1 million documents is a lot of stuff. A lot of it has not been made public yet. You can bet that even though it hasn't been made public yet, some of our most capable adversaries in terms of other intelligence services do have access to it. After all, he went to China and he went to Russia, right? And even though I don't believe he gave them anything, I believe they used their capabilities to take it from him. So I believe this is going to go down in history as the greatest loss of secrets in the history of the country. And just one more comment about Edward Snowden. I'll be quiet. He says that he wanted the American people to be the judge of this telephone metadata program that I told you about. He wanted the American people to decide whether it was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. If he really believes that, then he should also believe that the American people should be the judge of his actions in this regard. That means he should come home and be judged, right? But has he come home? No, he's still hanging out in Moscow.
We're starting to receive some questions from the audience. You mentioned in your earlier responses about the threat of cyber attack. We have several questions along those lines. But one member of the audience would like to know your assessment of our actual vulnerability currently for a cyber attack.
So it really, it depends on what you're talking about, right? So there's two types of things that people try to do. Actually, three types of things, I guess. One is states trying to steal data. You don't really know the size of that, right? You don't know what you don't know in terms of what people have stolen. But I do think that the director of the FBI was right when he said there are two types of companies in the United States: those who know they've been hacked and those who don't yet know they've been hacked. It's pervasive, the theft of data. People put the loss of intellectual property in the hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And then the second is this cybercrime, right? Stealing of personally identifiable information, right? And then using that for criminal gain, right? One of the biggies is people stealing your identity and getting themselves a tax return under your name, a tax refund under your name. That's big, it's huge, it's a real problem. Another simple one is somebody gets inside your system and freezes all of your photographs that you have on your laptop, right? And they say for $129 we'll unfreeze you for you. So are you going to go to the FBI, and go through all that trouble, or are you just going to pay the $129? Most people pay the $129 and get their photographs back. So cybercrime is huge, and I gave you the numbers before, right? And then the most dangerous is the placing of malware into a computer system, computer network to actually do damage. China and Russia are doing that today, placing of tools inside of networks. But they probably wouldn't use it unless we were in a hot war with them, right? Unless we were actually at war with them, and then they would use these cyber attacks against us. What would they be interested in attacking? And besides the U.S. government, U.S. defense industries, and then critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure like energy, telecommunications, and finance, right? That's their focus. But that's probably not going to be used unless we're in a war situation. But then you have countries like Iran and North Korea who are willing to do damage today. So you saw what North Korea did to Sony. Iran did an attack a couple of years ago on the Saudi National Oil Company and wiped out the data on 50,000 workstations. Just erased the data on 50,000 workstations. And so, and we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable to that kind of thing. Some companies in the U.S. are very, very, very good at this, defending against it. Some are just starting, and some don't really understand the threat yet. So it's a problem.
We have a question from one member of our audience, obviously an air traveler, who poses a question most of us can identify with. Do you think TSA's passenger screening is effective?
I guess not, given what we just heard, right? No, so this was a very interesting little test, right, that the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security did. It's exactly what you want the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security to do, right, which is to test the system. And as you know from reading the paper, that in a very, very high percentage of the cases, they were able to sneak through mock weapons and mock explosives. Very high percentage. I do know that the Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, which is a good friend of mine, has taken this very, very seriously and has put in place a number of actions to get at this problem. It's both, I think, a combination of the sophistication of the attacks and TSA needing to raise the bar, and some complacency on the part of TSA officers. So I think we've got to deal with both, and my sense is that the Secretary is all over this.
As we anticipated, we've received a good number of questions from our audience, more than we can ask in the time allotted here. We have time for 3 more questions. Here's one that might take a little explanation. Tell us the process by which you obtained the CIA's consent to write your book.
Oh, gosh. So anybody who thinks that I had it easy, because I was a former deputy director and acting director, wasn't in the room. It actually took the CIA longer to clear the book than it took me to write it. It's a very rigorous process. The book is shopped around the agency, and people who own the data, right? The experts on the data actually look at it, so it goes to a lot of different people and comes back to a central location. We had long conversations about the things they wanted me to take out. In some cases, they would say, "Michael, we think you should take this out," and I'd say, "Why?" And they'd say, "Here's why," and I'd say, "Oh yeah, you're right. Let's take that out." I don't want to give anything away. And then in some cases, they would say, "We want you to take it out," and I'd say, "Oh, you got to be kidding. That's not classified." We talk about it, and they would end up agreeing. So that was a long process, but it was, it's a good process, and it's really important, I think, for a secret intelligence organization in a democracy to be able to talk to the public as much as it can while still protecting secrets. And the process that I just described is designed to do both of those things.
We have several questions about how younger people might look for opportunities to follow a similar career path like you have followed. We have questions focusing on what you might recommend to be a college major. Would it be criminal justice, political science, foreign languages, world history? Just what exactly would the CIA be looking for at a young age?
So I'll say 2 things. One is, if you look at the people we hire, the vast majority have majors in political science, international relations, area studies, right? Middle Eastern studies, East Asian studies. The vast majority of them have language capability of some sort. The harder the language, the better. The harder the language, the better. And the vast majority of them have experience living and or working overseas. Living, working, or studying overseas. Those are 3 kind of commonalities, right? But I'll tell you that the most important, what they're looking for in an analyst, like I was, or what they're looking for in an operations officers, people who actually recruit other human beings to spy for the United States of America, there's a set of criteria that really have nothing to do with what your major is. So for an analyst, it's critical thinking skills, it's writing and oral communication skills, and it's intellectual curiosity. All right, those 3 things are must-haves to be hired as an analyst. And then for an operations officer, the must-haves are confidence, self-confidence to the point of overconfidence. Why? Because it's really hard to sit across the table from another human being and even make the pitch for them to spy for the United States. All right? And you got to have some confidence to do that. Incredible interpersonal skills, incredible emotional intelligence skills, right? Those are the 3 must-haves for an operations officer. So that has nothing to do with your major, right? And so they test for all of those things in both actual tests you take and then in interviews. So that's kind of how you want to think about it. Skill sets, and then what a usual hire looks like in terms of majors and life experiences.
Thank you for your thoughtful, informative, and often sobering observations here today. We often like to close with a lighthearted question here at Akron Roundtable, and whenever, as is the case here, we're sharing insights on security and confidential issues, oftentimes a shop-worn expression comes up, which is, "If I tell you, I'd have to kill you." So, I don't know, you've spoken now, and we've heard this. I mean, do you have to take us out here? I mean, is there any Kool-Aid we have to drink?
Yeah, I know the line, right? I know the line between classified and classified. You know, but if I could say just one more thing. You know, there's a lot of reasons I wrote this book. The most important reason is really the last chapter. The last chapter is about the dedication and commitment and hard work of intelligence officers to protecting their country and their sacrifices, including the ultimate sacrifice of a whole bunch in this war against Al-Qaeda. And so that's probably the most important chapter to me. So, you know, please spend some time.